Tim, when we spoke in March, ChatGPT had absolutely taken the world by storm, got the conversations going, including between you and I
Right.
about AI, generative AI specifically, AI more broadly. And we're just starting to have conversations about corporate responsibility, and the governments were trying to figure out what was going on. Is this something that needs to be regulated? Is it something we just need to watch more closely? What have you seen since then?
Well, the race is on. This is something you and I've discussed before. The notion of singularity, that you can have one entity that knows everything about you and everything that you need to know, both of those things. So you use it only. And we've been in rehearsal for this for the better part of a decade and a half with Google on the search front, and certainly with Facebook on the social front. It's not limited to just those two. Where we're headed is really interesting, and there's no doubt about it. OpenAI with ChatGPT-3, they did it just perfectly. They released GPT-3 and made a whole lot of noise about it to get that wave of adoption going. And then they gave us access to, if we were paying for it, GPT-4. A lot of people talk about this and say, oh, well, it put Google on their heels. Google wasn't ready for that. Well, maybe they weren't yet. And Meta with Llama 2, they had something in the garage that they were working on. And I think what we're seeing is this notion of what will replace search and what will replace social media. To me, the view is I have something that can answer my questions, can actually write things for me, can give me information. I used Anthropic's Claude, which I personally use, and I enjoy that model. Just as a funny one-off digression, I was spending some time with family on the Texas coast this summer, and because of the heat and some other things were going on a whim, I asked Claude, what's working to catch speckled trout on the Texas coast near Rockport, Texas, where I was staying? And in a matter of a second and a half, I got 3 paragraphs and a nice little 5-bullet outline of stuff I've read 1,000 times in fishing rags, from intel from fishing guides, or just what people say. But it was valid, is all I'm saying. It was just there. I did this instead of going to Google, instead of DuckDuckGo. That's what we're seeing here. And if you understand what that means, and I know you do, Brad, but for the people that are watching this and listening to it, what we're talking about when we say, or at least when I'm saying, replacing search and replacing social media, it's actually grabbing our time. It is grabbing our attention. And that is in the near term. How do these companies sustain their advertising revenue? And how do they get our data, which is part of this? It's by getting more of our attention and more of our time spent with these models. They're not just bots anymore. They've got many, many millions or billions of parameters. They're sitting on some very rich data sets. They don't have all the information in the world, period. That's the fun thing about it, is everybody goes, oh, they're sitting on everything that's on the internet. No, they're not. Their data sets are very thorough, but they're not whole in terms of everything that's happening. And the other thing is they're not real time. So they're not pulling in data in real time yet. What do you think, Brad?
Well, I think your point about time and attention is interesting and important as well. I read recently that there were concerns that the AI bubble was already bursting, which I don't agree with. I think that ChatGPT came along, as you mentioned, gave the ability for the general public to explore some really powerful tools on their own and kind of see possibilities for the first time. And I think there was tremendous adoption, tremendous interest. It certainly captured headlines for weeks or months. But
Right.
as we do, I think the general public, their attention is waning a bit. It's not to say that people don't find this interesting and won't find it useful long term, but I think the craze has passed just a little bit. And what has been reported as a decline in adoption or a decline in usage, I think is just the public saying, okay, I've checked it out. I know what's possible. This isn't right for me yet. And what I think is happening now is that there's a transition where the initial experience with generative AI is much like the blinking cursor computers from 30 years ago, where you sit down to a terminal and it had tremendous power, but you had to know exactly what to ask it. You had to know all of the commands.
Word processors, what we call them.
But the advent of the graphical user interface really made that more approachable for the general public, because you didn't have to memorize commands anymore. They were available to you right there in a menu, or contextual menus as you were typing and things like that. And that's obviously just gotten more and more powerful. So what I think has happened is we've kind of transitioned into this period where it was a great introduction to the public, but now developers and designers like InspiringApps are taking those tools and putting them into a format that is more usable, more approachable for consumers. Right. They can benefit from the technology without having to know how to author a prompt correctly to get your responses. I imagine, given your experience with the tools so far, you could craft something that would give you your phishing data quickly, effectively, but I can imagine there'd be plenty of people out there that don't know how to ask the question in the right way and wouldn't get such favorable results. So our job now is to embed those tools, generative AI and AI more broadly, into other applications so that consumers are benefiting from it, but don't necessarily have to know the intricate details about how to work with it.
Well, I think we're talking a whole lot about the consumer experience. The other side of this is, what does this do to replace humans on the front lines? And this was the case with chatbots, even very rudimentary, simple chatbots that could be programmed on FAQ lists. They could be programmed on the top 10 questions that customers had asked before, call logs from CX or contact centers. That kind of thing has always been there. This is a story since the earth cooled. As humans, we create tools that allow us to do things better, faster, and if possible, cheaper. And AI in all its forms, but what we're talking about here, generative AI, is one of those things that has some companies publicly stating on LinkedIn that they're reducing headcount. Some very big companies, IBM even, saying that they will readjust headcount plans for the next 12 months. And they're talking about market volatility or stock market volatility because of efficiencies in operations that can be gained through artificial intelligence. A general rule that we have at Brain+Trust is, do you have anything that's on your calendar that you do 3 times a week? Anything that you do 3 times a week? If you do, there's a pretty solid chance a machine can do it for you. Now, sometimes it has to be an actual physical machine. If you're feeding the dog or you're brushing your teeth, right? And I hope you do those things more than 3 days a week. But when it comes to creating content, that's the one thing that I see most everybody really excited about, is I can have a draft of something and then I can feed it to one of these models and then have it come back to me in a matter of seconds with a new version, with their edits of it, if you will. And that helps people to create content faster. I think that's exciting. The other side of it too is, I think, more than content strategists, more than folks who manage communities or managed organic content on social feeds, more than that, I think it's developers, it's coders, it's the folks that are on the delivery side of software. I think they're the ones who are probably in a position to leverage this technology. I read a lot about how folks are doing that to basically build code. It's not always accurate, but it's just like a blog post or a white paper or a letter you're going to send somebody that you would generate with one of these models. You pull it out and then you go wordsmith it, and you do the same thing if you're asking it to build code for you, to write code for you. You bring it out, you can tell by looking at it, or you can tell when you test it that something's not right. This creates efficiency. And what this does is this speeds the velocity at which I think we will see programmatic media. And what's interesting, hand in hand with this, is things like 5G and what comes after 5G in terms of connectivity. That creates more of a real-time connection. And if that real-time connection is there, then companies will need to iterate in terms of the stories they tell and better than that, the digital products they bring to market. So I throw that back to you because we don't build apps like you guys do, but at Inspiring Apps, I would imagine y'all may play with or be kicking the tires a little bit on how this technology can come in and help accelerate building an app.
For sure. And the examples that I cite around positions that I think are most vulnerable in the early days is copywriting. I think the very most basic copywriting is something that generative AI does well. I think in the same way, if your job is just to create code snippets or to be given a task to say, do this one thing, accomplish this one task, then I think generative AI can absolutely help in that regard. But in the same way that you probably would not have generative AI produce an entire novel for you, just segment by segment, it's going to end up looking like a book that was written by 50 authors. You also are probably not in the short term going to have generative AI developing entire applications, because what it's going to be good at is pulling in little bits. And I think in much the same way that a skilled author can leverage it as a tool, they're still the author of the work and they have an idea of the larger vision. I think for software, there's absolutely a corollary in that I think software architects, people who are skilled at understanding the big picture and how all the pieces need to fit together, are going to be in fine shape for quite some time. But the tools are getting better to write snippets of code that are frankly a little dull. They're likely error prone. They're the things that are just tedious to put together software. And I think if we can focus on the big picture, in some ways, that's the fun work. So it's still in good shape there.